This is the Gang of Witches Ibiza podcast, hosted by Joe Yule. Each new moon, we'll explore with our guests how to think globally and act locally with ecofeminism. Awaken all your senses. The spirit of the witches comes to your ears. The Sabbath is that way. Gang of Witches.
Welcome back to the Gang of Witches Ibiza podcast with me, Joe Yule. As we kick off the new year, we're finally going to meet a lady I've been trying to get together with for quite a few months now, but she's in demand as she starts her brand new role on the island as Director of Ibiza Preservation. Now, Inma Saranova is not new to the foundation. She's been working for 2 years as technical coordinator of its Sustainability Observatory, analysing and making known the data collected by the observatory in its annual reports. According to the president of the foundation, Philip Muelder, she is a great connoisseur of the issues that affect Ibiza and Formentera in terms of sustainability. So I've been very much looking forward to meeting her and finding out more, also on her background in radio and as a journalist, before she stepped into the shoes of her predecessor, Sandra Benbeniste, who's been on this series in episode 3. It's a huge undertaking to be responsible for the protection of the island, but also to be a woman who is taking over the reins of someone whose activism not only caused a stir, but played a huge part in rescuing the Balearics from the path of destructive, capitalistic oil companies parking up right off the shore of Ibiza to drill. So it's with a huge sense of anticipation I get to have this conversation and meet Inma Saranova and see what her stance of taking on the role entails and what her goals are for the year ahead and where she thinks she should begin to unravel them. So Inma, welcome to the Gang of Witches Ibiza podcast and a very happy and exciting chapter to kick off the new year, and a happy new year to you.
Feliz año nuevo para vosotros.
Happy New Year to you too.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much. So first off, a massive congratulations on your new role as Executive Director of Ibiza Preservation.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much. Thanks to you.
I mean, before we get into your plans for the year ahead as part of the foundation, I'd really love to hear a little bit more about your background and get to know you a little bit. So let's just begin at the beginning. Like, whereabouts in Spain did you grow up?
Nací en Soria.
Nacer en Soria, which is a small city in Castilla y León, and then Albacete, which is in Castilla-La Mancha. And after that, I travelled a lot.
Y después de eso he viajado mucho.
You know, how did you get that initial connection to Ibiza then? Because, I mean, you know, obviously it's not hard to fall in love with this island, but when did you first start to come here, or how did you get to know Ibiza?
No había estado en Ibiza nunca.
I'd never been to Ibiza until I was in my 30s, and I came here because my husband, my partner, passed his secondary school teaching exams on the island.
And obviously there was something here that kind of, you know, captivated your interest and your, you know, I guess it's, you know, not one of those places that's difficult to make you want to kind of stay.
Aquí en Ibiza la gente dice que...
Here in Ibiza, people say that the island either traps you or expels you. In our case, it got us for the obvious reasons. It's a beautiful, wonderful place, and it also provides a lot of job opportunities for educated people. When I arrived, what impressed me most about Ibiza were its beaches and its crystal clear water. I'd just come from living in Costa Rica, which is also a paradise, and the beaches of the Caribbean seemed like a movie. But I arrived in Ibiza and I realised that the best beaches in the world were right here in Ibiza and Formentera, and that's what I like the most.
So I'm kind of, you know, interested about your life as well, obviously, before you came directly here to Ibiza.
Llevo viviendo aquí 10 años.
I've been living here for 10 years, and before that I was living in Costa Rica doing my doctoral thesis. I have a PhD in development cooperation, and before that I was living in Valencia and in many other places working as a journalist.
Valencia y en otros muchos sitios trabajando como periodista.
I mean, that's why it feels like an absolute pleasure to be having this conversation. Obviously, as a fellow journalist and someone who's kind of been working in radio for the last 20 years, I was really excited to see that you were joining the team at Ibiza Preservation. I know that you've been working there for quite a few years now. But your radio show, Más de Una, or More Than One in English, where you were for about 6 years before you came here full time. Can you tell me a little bit about, what was that radio show focused on and why was it so important to you?
El programa de radio era un magazine local en el que hablaba cada día.
The radio program was a local magazine in which I talked every day for 2.5 hours about local news. And that made me meet a lot of people, practically everyone in Ibiza, both from administrations and companies as well as civil society.
Empresas, como la sociedad civil.
Did you call it More Than One? Was there somebody else presenting it before you started, or was it your own creation?
No.
It existed before I arrived. It's a program that's on all the local Onda Cero stations. I loved it, keeping up to date with everything that's going on Ibiza and being able to tell people about it.
Obviously that was a great way to get familiar with Ibiza before you actually moved here. You must have obviously made some good connections as well before you arrived.
Sí, era una forma ideal porque...
An ideal way because before I worked in radio, the circle in which I moved was very small. It was very, very small. And as a result of working in radio, I know practically everybody and everybody knows me.
Conozco a prácticamente todo el mundo y todo el mundo me conoce a mí.
I think that's probably only just the beginning, and now you've moved to a tiny island and you're going to be, Ibiza Preservation Director. I think that's also, the same kind of environment in many ways, because radio, I think, creates such a beautiful community, but that's also, I think, one of the plus points of what Ibiza has to offer.
El trabajo que he hecho en la radio, la verdad es que me ha servido para trabajar en...
The work I've done in radio, the truth is that it's helped me to work in Ibiza Preservation and do the work I was already doing in Ibiza Preservation before I became director. All of that work also helped me to strengthen my ties with Ibiza Preservation.
So, how did you get into presenting on the radio? How did that come about?
Comencé en la radio a trabajar.
I started working in radio after doing an interview on television for a project we had for a cultural association. There on television I met the director of Onda Cero, who liked my speech, particularly in relation to the cultural parts of it, and offered me the chance to start working, doing news.
Al cual le gustó, mi discurso, al menos en lo que tenía que ver con la cultura, y me ofreció la posibilidad de empezar trabajando haciendo noticias.
That's so interesting. That's actually, exactly what I've been doing for the last 2 decades. So obviously you did a degree in journalism as well?
Sí. Mi formación original es técnica.
My original training is in image and sound technology. After that, I studied journalism. And after that, I thought I wanted to change my life. I did a master's degree in development cooperation, and then I did a PhD in development cooperation, specialising in migratory movements. And as a result of that, I was able to work in Costa Rica and in other countries before coming here to Ibiza. When I came to Ibiza, I had the opportunity to return back to journalism, which is something I'm also passionate about. And thanks to Ibiza Preservation, I can mix the two sides of my training, which is journalism and research.
Y gracias a Ibiza Preservation puedo mezclar las dos vertientes de mi formación, que es el periodismo y la investigación.
I think I'm kind of interested in this idea that you started, doing the technician's role, then you became a journalist, and then you had, quite similar to my own path, like a real interest in environmental science and environmental culture and society, and obviously, working towards this goal of sustainability. So, I just wonder if that was something that, was inspired by your time being in Ibiza.
Desde que era joven.
Yes, Ibiza, of course, is a place that encourages people to take care of the environment. I mean, it's a beautiful place where anyone who lives here can see the fragility of the island. And I think that's why I've been more encouraged to fight for environmental rights and sustainability. But definitely, yes, Ibiza is a place that invites us to defend the environment. Since I was young, I've had a lot of political concerns. And that's why I've also been involved in activism in many different ways. And this activism has taken various forms. One of them is more direct and political, relating to the rights of migrants, which is my academic specialism. Another interest is cultural activism. When I was younger, I studied audiovisual communication, and I'm currently the director, the president of a cultural association in Ibiza, and the director of a festival.
I mean, I'm very interested in this idea that you specialised in this migratory movement, and it's something that we are focusing on actually this year on the podcast. So I'd love to hear actually a little bit more from you on that, if you're happy to talk about it, because I think, you know, obviously Ibiza is one of those places where people do come here and they're on their way somewhere else. So I'd be intrigued to see what your opinion is on that.
Bueno, a nivel académico me he especializado en movimientos migratorios.
At the academic level, I've specialised in migratory movements, especially those between the south and the north. That is to say, migratory movements that are normally motivated by poverty or extreme situations of war, etc. However, having studied all of this, I have also been able to realise how migratory movements in the north itself, in rich countries, in places like Ibiza, are also a reflection of what can happen on a global level. Ibiza is very special in that sense because it's always been a receiver of migrants, but it's also been a place that has expelled migration into the past. It's something we don't keep so present in our daily lives. And this is something important to me, the idea that Ibiza is a place that was built by the arrival of migrants, some of them with a high level of purchasing power, as can happen now with people who come from Europe or other countries like the United States to make Ibiza their second home, but also with many people who come here to make a living, people who come from southern countries or from the rest of the world, people who come from southern countries or from the rest of the peninsula in search of opportunities. Ibiza has a very special society and economic structure, which means that people can continue to come to work here under very different and diverse circumstances. On the one hand, Ibiza welcomes people here, but it is also true that the economic circumstances of the island mean that the people who come to work, above all in the tourist sector, are in precarious situations, which sometimes also translate into social inequalities, and which in some cases are also motivated by environmental circumstances. In the end, Ibiza is the ideal place to see a reflection of what is happening in the rest of the world, but on a very small scale. And in this sense, I think it would be worthwhile to focus a bit more on this issue, as you do in your podcast, on these migratory flows, and not only on the temporary movements of people, not on tourism, which is something that is studied more, but which in the end is also involved in the rest of the more or less seasonal and more long-term migratory movements of migration. I believe that there is no migration problem in Ibiza or in the rest of Spain beyond the simple fact that the migrants themselves face laws in Europe and Spain which do not take their human rights into account. That is the real migration problem. We're not in a situation, despite what some people would have us to believe, in which our status quo or our well-being as people from the north is in danger because of migrants arriving in Ibiza. If anything, without immigrants on Ibiza, there would be no Ibiza. Without immigrants, there would be no people working to create the wealth that there is on this island. And that should make us rethink whether the distribution of the wealth that is generated even by these people, the working people, is really balanced and fair. If we come to the conclusion that it is not, which is my personal viewpoint, then we should start working to change the situation.
I mean, yeah, that's kind of how I feel about things. And I think, you know, migration of sorts is one of the main problems, I think, that sustainability experiences in many ways, because the island is either full of people or kind of half empty. And it's kind of, you know, I guess if that was a more sustainable model year round, then we wouldn't be experiencing the kinds of kind of problems that we do have in Ibiza.
Claro, yo distingo entre inmigración y turismo.
Of course, I distinguish between immigration and tourism. One thing is immigration and the other thing is tourism. I understand that migrants are the ones who come and settle here. They are the ones who are working. That's why I say that there is no problem in Ibiza with immigration. And what is clear is that year after year, the human saturation, and we can see this in the indicators of the Ibiza Preservation Sustainability Observatory, is increasing. There was a break with the coronavirus crisis in 2020. For the first time, the saturation rates in Ibiza dropped. But from what we see in the year 2021, the trend has returned. We will have to analyse it next year, and surely if we don't take measures, the number of people arriving on the island every summer on a seasonal basis in the form of tourists will logically increase. The island has a finite capacity for resources and for accommodating people, and tourism cannot continue to grow ad infinitum. This is a fact. However, much of this discourse often arouses hostility in the business sector dedicated to tourism. No, this is not a threat. To spell it out clearly that Ibiza and tourism cannot continue to grow ad infinitum. It's incredible that we have to still keep on saying it. And what does this mean? That if we want the tourist sector to be sustainable, not only environmentally, but also in business terms, it has to be a tourism sector that doesn't die of its own success. I mean, 2 years ago, we could already see that the tourist perception of Ibiza got worse the more people there were. That is to say, tourist overcrowding worsens the perception that the tourists themselves have of the island. This can drive people away. So it's time to start doing something about it, to take into account empirical and scientific data to see what the real carrying capacity of the island is, both in the high season months and in the rest of the year, in order to be able to take measures on this issue. This is not a radical discourse, it's reality. There will come a time when tourism will not be sustainable even for business activity. Then we have to be guided by empirical data and start putting measures in place. In that sense, we cannot go on growing ad infinitum. This does not mean that we are against tourism, but simply respecting the number of tourist places in Ibiza and making sure that we do not encourage illegal accommodation. We should already be doing that and shaping a new, more sustainable tourism model.
What are you actually saying in terms of, how many people are coming here in high season compared to what you think that the island can actually cope with?
No podemos calcularlo.
We can't calculate it because we don't have the data. There is data on how many people come by plane, for example. But we know that these are more people than can be accommodated by the hotels at maximum capacity. Then the question is, where do these people stay? If it's illegal to rent to tourists, and there are more people than there are tourist places in hotels, we can estimate it with the number of flights arriving per year, how many people more or less have visited us, but we don't know how many days they've stayed, if the one who arrived on Monday has left on Tuesday or left a month later. We can make estimates, but we don't know for sure. For me, the limit should be that the number of people who legally fit in legal accommodation should be able to enter the island. Then there is a margin of people who come to visit family or who stay maybe temporarily somewhere. But a large part of that margin is people who are staying in illegal accommodation, which does not comply with the law, which does not pay its taxes, which does not carry out any kind of review of safety or sanitary measures, and who certainly do not face any kinds of controls over how much water is being used, what level of waste they're producing, and all of that. Therefore, it's not possible to monitor the real impact of this kind of tourism on the island. We can make rough estimates. I know there are people who work in this field who agree with these kind of estimates and don't agree. But if we're realistic and if this is what we really feel is important, I think we need to find out what the carrying capacity of the island is in the summer.
Why is there not data, official data about how many people come in? That is got to be something surely that has to be addressed.
Claro, es difícil porque el único dato que tienes.
Of course, it's difficult because the only data you have is the number of arrivals by plane or the number of arrivals by boat. But that's all. You don't know how long they've been here. Of course, this happens not only in Ibiza but everywhere else. There's always a floating population. You can estimate it, but you can't realistically calculate it. And it's also very difficult to decide on the carrying capacity of a territory before it starts to degrade. However, what we can do is take measures such as those put in place in Formentera with the issue of cars. If we can see what the carrying capacity of the territory of Ibiza is in summer, we can see how many cars are circulating on the Santa Eulalia road to see if the traffic is viable or not. In that sense, this measure in Formentera has worked very well. They've set a quota. Can so many cars enter in summer? And it's worked very well so far. When it was first put in place, there were people who said this is going to be a problem for tourism, they won't want to come anymore. This has not happened, and it wouldn't happen here on Ibiza either. And I think that the local authorities do want to take a measure like this. And in that sense, from Ibiza Preservation, we invite them to do it, because it's easy to establish the number of vehicles that can enter the island. We have one of the highest rates of car use in Spain, according to data from the Sustainability Observatory. And this is something that is very difficult to manage in such a small territory as Ibiza. This is an area where limits must be set.
There's so much to unpack there, but, from what I understand, you're saying about the cars, but it's supply and demand. It's the same with, Airbnb or people renting out their apartments. Everyone, is trying to kind of offset the extreme expense of this island that lives here. So everyone's trying to make money. And obviously, because of COVID, we've also had this crazy couple of years where, the Ibiza Food Bank has been completely and utterly, at capacity, trying to feed everybody that hasn't been able to make ends meet or make enough money while there were no tourists here. So there's a very tricky situation. I totally appreciate what you say about the fact that, there's too many people here. That's obvious. But how, what's the answer to this? What would you like to see?
Es muy difícil encontrar el equilibrio en una situación en la que ya existía un desequilibrio previo.
It's very difficult to find a balance in a situation where there was already a previous imbalance. The COVID crisis has only highlighted the huge social inequalities in Ibiza. I was also talking about this earlier with the migration crisis. A lot of people have left in the winter because, with the nightclubs closed or with other businesses that have suffered from the crisis, they've been left without work and they've had to leave. Of course, it's a system that is always in a difficult balance, basically because there is no diversification of the economy when Ibiza's economic model is exclusively a tourist monoculture model. The moment something goes wrong, as the coronavirus has clearly shown, everything goes up in smoke. The people just survive as best they can. But of course, this is a time to reflect on whether it is sustainable not only environmentally but also economically, that a territory like Ibiza relies on basically one single source of income. Because when that source of income is threatened, the whole social structure is put in danger. We've seen the queues at Red Cross and at Caritas of people waiting for food aid, people who previously were not desperate or destitute. Not to say that those people are not here, because they are. Ibiza hosts tremendous inequalities, but people who until that point had been working and who suddenly were left with zero income and with extremely high rents that they couldn't afford to pay. And suddenly the fragility of the system reveals itself. That's why, among other things, at Ibiza Preservation we propose a diversification of the economy towards other sectors. For example, the primary sector, agriculture, etc., which can provide people with alternative work options and can also offer the island more food sovereignty than we had before. Because another of Ibiza's big problems is that a lot of the food we consume, perhaps 90%, comes from outside the island. This is unsustainable. Socially, economically and environmentally, we're feeding a system in which farmers work for very little money, underpaid and with poor conditions. The consumers in the north are paying extortionate prices for these fruit and vegetables, and in between there is a system that takes all of that money and benefits no one, neither the person who grows it nor the person who consumes it. We have to push for Ibiza to grow more of its own produce, and that the people of Ibiza consume local, zero-kilometre fruit and vegetables. That way, we will be benefiting the economy, the workers and the environment, because we will be taking away food miles, we will be taking away tons of CO2 that we throw into the environment to be able to eat what we eat every day, and we will also be tending to the local environment and eating a much healthier diet. By this I mean there are alternatives available and we have to fight for them. The environmental alternatives have to be social advantages and the social advantages have to be environmental, because in the end we only have one planet Earth. If we spoil it, we're not going anywhere. Our personal situations and successes won't matter if we don't have food to eat or air to breathe. We're not going to get very far, are we? Do you know what I mean?
Once upon a time in Ibiza, with Alex Gray.
A love letter from Ibiza. Do you hear me calling your sweet soul your name? I am the melody of song that breathes through all the pores of your skin. As you walk my sacred land, I am the goddess that awakens within. You fall, you kiss this earth, as the indigenous farmer harvests the fruits, giving life, forging worth. I am the nourishment, I am the roots of the ancient fig tree. I am drinking your tears as you stand before me. The rhythm of drums the lush forest leaves, the pirates, the smugglers arriving from sea. The moonbeams dancing on two white blossom. As you contemplate, you remember the soul you have forgotten. I called you here, I answered your prayer. You fly on the wings of hope to my promised land, a paradise of paradox, awaiting the truth to evoke. Infinite stories of conquer of loss. I am the goddess, the peasant, the lover, the wife. I am the earth keeper. My hands and feet dig deeper into the fertile moss. Hear my cry from the stars, sea and sky. I am the echo in the hills. I am the well the rain fills. The matrix of roots that lie beneath my rock, the ever-present drumming of my ticking clock. I see you dance. I see you love. I see you from below. I see you above. But my heart now bleeds. It is ravaged. It is sore. I call you forth for a revolution, a regeneration. I rise once more.
That is a very, very, very complex issue, 100%. And, you know, I think Sandra Benbeniste, your predecessor, who you obviously paid homage to at the beginning of this interview, which wasn't included, but, you know, she did so many amazing things. And I can see, you know, you are definitely the right lady to step into her shoes. You're very passionate, you know, about all the same conversations I've had with her over the years. And I feel, you know, obviously importation, not just the cars, but the food, you know, clearly localization is the answer to all of this, including ideally the people that live here. And obviously if there was less tourism and more of an all year round model of the people that actually reside here, I feel like that would be a huge answer to a lot of these problems. But it's just like the how do you change that? I mean, I guess that's not exactly your job, but it's very interesting that you've absorbed all of this in your kind of run up to this position at Ibiza Preservation, and you've witnessed and observed so much from being here, living here and working as a journalist. So I find it's very interesting to hear your perspective. So thank you for that. I think, you know, let's start with what kind of steps would you like to take to begin with to try and address some of these problems? I mean, there's a lot of them, clearly, but, you know, where do you even begin?
Bueno, gracias por tus palabras amables.
Well, thank you for your kind words. Where to start? Well, first of all, I think we should start by gathering empirical data and overcoming particular perceptions and discourses which perhaps have more to do with people's ideologies than anything else. We at Ibiza Preservation always try to take initiatives based on the detection of real problems. And for that, we have, as I mentioned earlier, the Sustainability Observatory, which every year makes an annual report which looks at different environmental indicators to see how we are improving or getting worse or stagnating in various areas, and that have to do with the ecology and the environment of the island, from CO2 emissions to the integral water cycle, through the preservation of Posidonia or anything else from there. What are we doing? Well, we look at what has happened in the last year, whether we've improved, how we've improved it, what has been done well. Because many times in environmentalism, we focus a fair bit on denouncing the negative aspects, but not on seeing what is already improving. We at Ibiza Preservation always want to focus a bit on that, on proactivity, because it's necessary to see that things can be changed, that this is not a lost war, that no matter how much bad news we talk about, it's also necessary to emphasize the good news. If it's human beings who are damaging the environment, it's those same human beings who are speaking out right now and listening to us. So brilliant. We can change things. They are already changing. We look at what is being done, what is getting worse. We see what the trend is, what has happened over the years. why we think it is getting worse, so that we can then put solutions in place and invite the relevant administrations and those responsible for making decisions at the legal level to actually do so. Why? To put in the spotlight those companies that can do better, because it can be done better without endangering a particular economy. In Ibiza Preservation, we insist economy and environment are not at odds with each other. They never have been. Human beings have been on the face of the earth for millions of years, and it's only now that we've started to do things really badly. So in that sense, we also have the opportunity to change things. And of course, in terms of the people who listen to us on an individual basis, we also invite people to look at how they live, how they consume, how they treat the earth in terms of the generation of waste and consumption of natural resources. We encourage people to review our privileges as consumers, as people, in this case living in Ibiza, to see what is going to be good for us not only in the short term, but also for the next generations. I'm 40 years old right now. We're at the end of 2021. And that means that in 2060, I might not be alive, but a person who has just been born now, 2060 is a very close horizon, and it can be critical. There are people who are talking about environmental collapse lying just over the horizon in 2050. That is where we all have to act. And above all, what we have to do is move from words to action. And it is in our hands, administrations, companies and individuals, people, citizens, individually and collectively. Let's unite and look for solutions. We have known how to do it before, and we have to know how to do it now, because I don't think anyone wants to take the blame for being the last generation that ruined everything on Earth, right?
Thank you. I mean, yeah, I totally agree. And I find it really interesting as well that you said before, when we were talking about your specialisms and your passions, that you were really into, you're an activist. And clearly that's kind of very obvious from the conversation we're having. And I really liked what Barack Obama said at the COP26, because he was talking about, he was kind of encouraging young people really to stay angry and stay frustrated and stay, in this space where they are willing to take action and to continue to protest and to continue to encourage world leaders to kind of sit up and actually do something. Action is needed. And I'm really excited to be having this conversation, because it feels like there's a lot of fire in your belly, which is amazing. I think you talked about, one of the main challenges in your role is to try to help the islands advance towards the environmental markers established by the UN Sustainable Development Goals. That's under the 2030 agenda. I mean, for starters, how would you describe what those goals are?
Venga, los Objetivos de Desarrollo Sostenible de la Agenda 2030 de Naciones Unidas en realidad es un acuerdo de mínimos.
Let's look at the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN Agenda 2030. It really is a minimum agreement. We should not think that the Sustainable Development Goals are a panacea for a better world. It is a minimal agreement. That is, the minimum that can be done to ensure that we live from 2030 in a moderately sustainable world, environmentally, socially and economically. In other words, we cannot even think that this is the optimum. No, it's the absolute minimum that we can do, meeting these goals, to guarantee a moderately livable world from 2030 onwards. That's why we at Ibiza Preservation are also focusing on this. And I think we have to raise awareness among the population that this is the minimum we have to reach. If we want to live in a place where people can breathe, where they can eat, where they have social rights, etc., then we have a lot to improve. I see this as difficult, considering that it is so complicated to reach these minimums. What do the Sustainable Development Goals consist of? They are grouped into 17 areas, which are the 17 goals. What needs to be done to achieve certain goals? For example, Goal 2 aims to end hunger, which might sound utopian, but it's very feasible. It doesn't take a huge investment to end hunger on Earth, which says very little about us as a species, considering that there is money, right? And that it's easy for all of us to agree on how to put an end to it. The United Nations gives us some indicators of what we can do about it. Amongst these, for example, is the same goal to end hunger. The United Nations gives us some indicators of what we can do about it. Amongst these, for example, in the same goal to end hunger, is the subject of food sovereignty that we were talking about earlier. What can we do in places like Ibiza? Sometimes people think that the Sustainable Development Goals are goals that poor countries have to achieve, but they're goals for the whole world. In other words, in Ibiza we can contribute to ending hunger by improving food sovereignty. We were talking about this a little while ago. If something happened and we suddenly became cut off from mainland food supplies in Ibiza, we would have little chance unless we have food sovereignty and improve our agriculture. So what are the other areas to focus on in a country like Spain? Well, for example, the subject of emissions or energy self-sufficiency. In Ibiza, in this area, we are really lacking. Ibiza is a place where we have many hours of sunshine a year, and yet we really don't yet rely on clean, renewable energy, for example, photovoltaic energy. By switching over, we could guarantee that less CO2 is emitted into the environment because it would reduce what is being emitted from the power stations. Increasing this type of energy doesn't even require a big investment. We've done the studies that show this clearly. And by taking advantage of the urban roofs and the roofs of rural buildings on Ibiza and putting photovoltaic panels on public car parks, plus photovoltaic panels on the 2% of abandoned agricultural land, we would achieve 98% of the energy that Ibiza needs to be autonomous. In other words, a really small investment is required to achieve this. We have a lot of work to do on these objectives because in the end, the CO2 that we throw into the environment does not stay here on Ibiza. It's not just us who will have to deal with its effects. Instead, it all contributes to the global environment. So in the end, we all have to take responsibility for making a better world. We all have to play our part.
I think, I've just seen the time. This is a good place to end because our next episode is going to be about fossil fuels and we're going to speak to the Alianza Mablava. And I think, that was also one of Sandra's major passions and goals and points of activism that she was working towards was, this idea that some of the solar panels, there was like a tax on the sun or something ridiculous in Spain that existed. And I know that almost 50% or more of the island's energy comes from fossil fuels, which is a disaster. This really must change. And, I think it's just not okay, particularly in a place that has as much sun as we have. So it's just madness. There's so many things that need to progress. And I feel really happy that you've joined the team at Ibiza Preservation. I'm sure everybody else feels exactly the same. And it must be, with someone like Sandra obviously being in the role before you, I mean, what an amazing example that she set. And I don't, have any doubt at all that you're going to do an amazing job. And thank you so much for talking to us. I mean, what's, where do you even begin with the last question? But, what's the first step? Because it looks like you've got quite a lot of, quite a lot on your plate.
Es difícil saber por dónde empezar, pero lo que hay que hacer sobre todo es empezar. Primero, ver qué estamos haciendo particularmente para mejorarlo.
It's difficult to know where to start, but the main thing to do is to start by reflecting on what we're already doing and to improve it. To see what can be done by us as a community. And then to ask, to demand that those in power, whom we have previously voted for, take the appropriate measures to ensure that our society is truly sustainable. In this sense, as voters, we have a lot to say, and I therefore invite all political parties of all colours to join in a real fight for the preservation of the environment. We have to leave behind some ideological prejudices in this regard, so that we can all work for the common good, which is the care of our home, which is the earth, and in this case, this little piece of our home, which is Ibiza. So first of all, to look at how we're behaving on an individual basis. And secondly, to demand that organisations and companies, those which provide us consumable goods, and the political parties that we vote for, make policies aimed at sustainability and regeneration, because it is possible and it is necessary.
Thank you so much for joining us here today, Inma. Really appreciate your time. I know you're busy. I know you've had a bit of time out to recuperate fully, but thank you for making time to meet us today.
Gracias a ti.
Thank you. And thank you for all the work that you're doing with this podcast, which is very interesting, and I will be very happy to participate in it in the future.
It was the Ibiza podcast of Gang of Witches, hosted by Joe Yule. See you at the next new moon. Until then, take care of yourselves.
Calling upon my witches everywhere, my witches everywhere. I'm calling upon my sisters everywhere.